I love handheld gaming, and so the promise of what the Steam Deck can offer in terms of bringing the PC gaming environment into a handheld is something that is really exciting to me. But it's also that core concept that I think does lead to where a lot of the kind of friction comes with the Steam Deck as a system. See, when you talk about a lot of these other systems, like say the Nintendo Switch, these are platforms that are designed to have an ecosystem built around them. Whereas the Steam Deck is kind of a reverse situation where it's taking a pre-existing gaming ecosystem, specifically Steam on PC, and doing its absolute best to just cram that concept into a handheld and make it work as well as it can. And the times that it does work well is a great experience. But there's a variety of different things I've encountered in my time with it that make that experience a little weird. I've had the Steam Deck for about a week, and in that time I've really focused on using it as a sort of simple, out-of-the-box device. There is a lot of wackier stuff you can mess with it to make it do, and that is something I plan on doing in the future, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on that content. But for now, I really wanted to just kind of build some impressions based on its intended purpose as a PC gaming handheld. First off, let's just focus on the core experience, playing games in handheld mode. And one of the things that's really interesting about the Steam Deck is that while it does have a lot of games that don't necessarily work quite right on it just yet, Valve has definitely gone out of their way to try and make that experience as generally smooth as possible. For instance, when you're looking through the Steam store, all games have a Steam Deck compatibility rating. And to be fair, one of these ratings is unknown, meaning that it just hasn't been tested yet, and maybe the game will work great, maybe it won't at all. Meanwhile, those games that have been tested are either going to be completely verified, they're going to work and be playable but have some problems, or they are considered something that is unplayable on the system. Verified games are those that should work entirely as intended. You should be able to use all the controls on the Steam Deck with zero issue. It should be an intuitive experience that feels native to the system. There's never going to be any kind of odd moments in the game that require you to do something that's a little more out of the box. Graphics, visuals, everything should be running perfectly smoothly on the Steam Deck. The playable category, on the other hand, are where things get a little more interesting. There is something about the game that doesn't necessarily play quite just right with the Steam Deck. And what's really interesting about this is that this is a very broad generalization and category. There are a variety of different things that could be wrong that lead to different specific experiences. In some cases, the issue could be something as simple as, oh, in-game text doesn't really give you a scaling option and it wasn't designed for a screen of this size, so yeah, it's going to be really tiny and sometimes hard to read. Other situations might call attention to performance issues, where the game does work and play on the system, but certain specific graphical effects or things that can happen in-game are not going to appear or work quite right. There's even some situations that are called attention to that are honestly extremely minor and don't even come up that often. For instance, games requiring you to make use of the OS-level keyboard. An example of this would be, say, Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster, one of the simplest of games you could be playing on the Steam Deck that overall feels very native until you get to the point that you need to name a character, and well, it's looking for a keyboard that you don't have attached to the system. The fix for this is that you're able to bring up an OS-level keyboard by hitting a combination of the Steam button and the X button, and then you can use it. This comes up extremely rarely, basically just when you have to name characters, and so it's considered a playable, not fully verified game because, yeah, every now and then you're going to have to come up against that fact. Which also, to the system's credit, it does go out of its way to really try and remind you of those specific situations. So for instance, when you start a game that requires the keyboard, it'll give you a notification right away saying like, hey, just remember, you might need to do this, here's the button combo you gotta have in mind. While the verified tier represents those games that are 100% meant to work just perfectly fine on the system, I gotta say that in my experience, the vast majority of playable games work perfectly just fine. They're going to have their odd little moments like having to navigate through the game's initial launcher or, again, needing to bring up the keyboard, but these are usually kind of just small little inconveniences and not something that sours the entire experience. Something that I did find interesting though and lightly frustrating is how some controls are translated over in some games, particularly those that require more traditional keyboard mouse style inputs. Some of these are extremely intuitive and make a lot of sense, and there's others where things get maybe a little bit weirder. I think a prime example of this would actually be going back and playing the old school Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where when you're in regular gameplay, it feels like a pretty normal experience. Both sticks are doing what they're supposed to do as far as moving and looking around. The buttons that you think should work for things like activating objects or swinging a weapon all check out. But where it gets a little awkward is opening up the game's menu system, where things default to the Steam Deck's regular desktop interface style. So whereas you might expect being able to just kind of move the D-pad or sticks around to select different things and press A to do that, that's not it. Instead, now you're using the right stick to emulate a mouse pointer that you're then moving around, and then using right trigger to click on things, which ultimately, once you figure that out, isn't that huge of a deal, but it's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind when you first play the game, and you have to take a moment to be like, wait, okay, how exactly am I supposed to interface with this? Cool. I really want to try a variety of different genres on this device, whether that's old school RPGs, modern day FPS, action adventure games, puzzle titles, fighting games, and the general experience I've found is that anything that is designed for controller in mind in the first place is overall a very seamless experience. And even in some cases where a game is really designed more so for keyboard and mouse, it is ultimately an experience that will work. It's not always going to be the most intuitive, and it's not always going to be the most efficient either compared to what it could be like playing on a traditional interface, but it's an experience that you could get away and play with and ultimately have a good time, which is the important part. One thing that plays into all this as well that honestly pleasantly surprised me a lot is just the physical build of the system. At first glance, I wasn't really in love with the button layout of the Steam Deck, and of course the fact that it's also a gigantic system. But while it's not exactly the most portable, you're certainly not going to fit it in a pocket, it is very comfortable to use. The curved designs on the back of the body just make for a much better long-term gaming experience when compared to the sort of flatter design that most handheld systems tend to have. Also across the board, the buttons, sticks, triggers, everything feels really nice. Really, the only kind of complaints I have to do with the touchpads. Part of it is the fact that I'm just not really used to using them. I'm trying my best to get into really seeing the merit in them, but you know, back in the day, I tried the Steam controller. I was not a fan, and with this one, I find myself just still being a lot more comfortable with the more traditional use of sticks or the D-pad. And on that note, that is also another thing that messes me up, is that because I'm used to the layout on a lot of other systems, the touchpad being below the stick and the D-pad being off to the side really throws me off. But overall, in terms of just the layout of everything and the feeling of the buttons and sticks, it's all really solid. Now, most of the problems I've talked about so far have obviously been just kind of small little things, right? Small inconveniences that slightly mess with your experience, but they kind of paint, I think, a larger picture of what the kind of general one big problem I have with the Steam Deck is that because this is trying to sort of fit another ecosystem into the handheld, not enough things are always necessarily handled intuitively well enough or even explained well enough, and nothing represents this frustration and issue for me more than trying to dock the system. As of right now, Steam has not released their own official dock option, and perhaps when that is released, there's going to be some OS updates to the system that will make all of this run smoother. But as things are right now, you can dock a Steam Deck to a television and connect to keyboard and mouse and play stuff, but it isn't going to be the intuitive experience that you would expect and hope for. I mean, when you look back at something like, say, the Switch and what has made that concept popular, it's the simplicity, right? You have this handheld, you drop it in a dock, bam, it's on the TV, and use the Joy-Cons, you're good to go. Steam Deck, little more steps involved. First off, you need to get a USB-C adapter that's going to allow you to hook up to HDMI or some kind of display, as well as having USB ports to plug in a keyboard and mouse, unless you want to go the Bluetooth route for those things. And the kind of first gut instinct that, you know, I had at least for doing this is just take the system, turn it on, hook it up, try and play a game. In which case, things got very weird. First off, the display doesn't always properly translate over to an external monitor. Sometimes it's blown up and is extremely zoomed in. Sometimes it's not and works okay. And then once you get into the game, you'll still run into some oddities, like the fact that you're still capped at the system's regular resolution of 800p, and mouse controls don't actually work at all because they're trying to emulate the touchpad of the system, leading to all kinds of wacky and strange things that can happen depending on the game you're playing, whether that's limiting the field of motion or just causing the slightest nudge of the mouse to make the camera absolutely flip out. Now you're probably wondering, I've seen other people talk about docking the system and having no problems. What exactly is the issue here? Well, the issue here is that you cannot really dock the system in its current form while using the regular SteamOS interface. Instead, if you want to dock the system and really make use of it as a docked system, you need to reboot the Steam Deck specifically in desktop mode. This is basically a function where you abandon the SteamOS user interface that treats it more like a traditional gaming console and instead reboot it to act like a little portable PC. You'll be greeted by a Linux desktop and you can then proceed to use it as you would like any kind of other PC. A big use of this would be to make use of the browser if you want to use certain media streaming sites and that kind of thing. But this is also how you really get the most out of the docking situation with the Steam Deck. So you'll reboot in desktop mode, launch Steam inside desktop mode, then click to launch the game, and now it is a fully functional experience where you can not only do things like adjust to higher resolutions for those games the Steam Deck can handle at them, but you'll also have properly working keyboard and mouse controls. This is a much bigger headache version of the same kind of thing we were encountering earlier, right? Where ultimately there is a way that all of this works, and once you know how that works, it's fine. But it's not really what I think a lot of people would expect something to do out of the box. You would think that a device that's designed to be dockable would work. Now again, their own official dock option has not released yet, so perhaps this is something that has just been sitting on the back burner and is going to get updated and fixed once that is released. But for the time being, if you want to dock a Steam Deck, this is how it works. Really what it all comes down to is that the experience of using a Steam Deck right now feels a lot like an exercise in trial and error. There's a lot of things that just work out of the box and are great, and there's a lot of other things that don't work quite the way you would expect them to, and you have to figure out why. It's like there's a whole lot of hidden rules you have to learn about this system that isn't really clearly spelled out anywhere. This all goes back to something that I kind of at first suspected this first wave of Steam Decks would be like, which is if you're the kind of person who likes to mess with your tech and figure out how to do stuff with it, whether that's things it's meant to do or things that it's not really meant to do, the Steam Deck is really interesting. But if you're the kind of person that just wants to buy a handheld that's going to work right out of the box and play your favorite games, no fuss, that's not entirely the situation here. Depending on what kind of games you want to play and how you want to play them, you might experience no problems whatsoever, but you might also encounter a whole lot of odd little eccentric things you're going to have to jump hoops through. And what this all goes back to really is I think that ultimately this is kind of a test. Obviously, one of the things we've seen with the Steam Deck is that it's being released in waves, it's kind of just coming out here and there, and while some of that I'm sure does go back to supply chains and how many they can produce at a time, I also suspect that Valve is intentionally trying to pace out how quickly these are reaching a large number of hands as they continually work on the system and improve the experience more and more with every passing week. In the 1 week that I've had this system, I have had 3 software updates happen, one of which was right when I first received the system, obviously, but there are constantly new features and functions and refinements that are happening with the system constantly, which is ultimately a very good thing because it's something that is getting better and better all the time. But what it does also mean is that the experience of using one of these fresh out of the box 6 months from now could be a very different experience from what people are trying and messing with right now. When the Steam Deck works, it works beautifully, and personally, I cannot wait to see what the future of this device looks like. But as of right now, it does feel like it's a bit in its infancy. There are a lot more games that need to get verified for the platform, and on top of that, really, I'm a lot more curious to see what a new model in the next few years could look like, or even how this model could turn out with enough major patches applied to the OS. So those are my impressions of the Steam Deck after about a week of regular use. There are some more hyper-focused videos, as well as some slightly weirder things with the system I want to start messing with, so if you don't want to miss out on that content, make sure to subscribe. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button to let me know, or hit dislike if you didn't like it, just because you guys don't see the ratio. I still do, and it's good info for me to have, and I will see you guys later.